On Thanksgiving, at the same table where I had sat for 34 years, my daughter-in-law put her hand on the back of my chair and said, "Dell, this isn't your seat anymore." The whole room went still. I bought this house. I paid off every dollar of that mortgage. I built most of this place with my own two hands, and now my daughter-in-law was standing there talking like she owned it. My son didn't say a word. He just looked down at his plate. I didn't raise my voice. I folded my napkin, set it beside my water glass, and said, "I need to step outside for some air." And I walked out of that dining room. 11 minutes later, I came back. And what I carried through that door turned that room upside down. My son went white, because not one person in that house knew that for the last 9 days I had been recording everything. And what they were about to hear would make every one of them understand something. Taking that chair away from me was the biggest mistake they ever made. My name is Odell Tullos. Most people call me Dell. I'm 68 years old, and I live on 9 acres off Oaks Highway on the side of Lookout Mountain outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is 1,979, in a service van with 190,000 miles on it. I started Tullos Refrigeration and Ice with that van, a set of gauges, and a contract to service the walk-in coolers at 4 grocery stores in Red Bank. Commercial refrigeration, not glamorous. Nobody has ever asked me about my work at a party. But every restaurant in this valley has a walk-in, and every walk-in fails eventually, and it always fails on a Friday night with $40,000 of inventory in it. By 2011, I had 9 branches across East Tennessee and North Georgia, 140 employees, my name on the side of 31 trucks. My wife Ruthie used to say I could hear a compressor going bad through a brick wall. She wasn't far wrong. She died 4 years ago. In the choir loft at church, on a Sunday morning, in the middle of the second hymn, an aneurysm. She was 63, and she was singing. People tell me that's a merciful way to go, and I know they mean it kindly. I have not yet been able to make myself agree. That house on Ox Highway is a brick ranch I've added onto twice with my own hands. Wrap-around deck on the back that looks down toward the valley. 9 acres I cleared myself back when my knees still worked the way knees are supposed to. I paid it off in full 21 years ago, the same spring I opened the 7th branch. Ruthie made a pot roast and we ate it on the deck and she cried a little. That house was supposed to be where I got old on purpose. Instead, for about 14 months, it had become a place where I lived like a man who'd been given a spare room and hadn't yet been told when he was leaving. My son Grant moved back in 19 months ago with his wife Simone. His freight brokerage in Atlanta had gone under. He called me from a parking deck and I could hear it in his voice before he said a word. I didn't hesitate, not for 1 second. That's what a father does. I gave them the big bedroom on the end. The one with the morning light Ruthie loved, the one I hadn't been sleeping in anyway because I'd been sleeping in the recliner in the den for about 2 years by then and telling everybody it was my back. I told them stay as long as it takes. 6 months later, Simone suggested gently, the way she does everything, and I want to be fair to her. She has never once raised her voice at me in 11 years, that I might be more comfortable in the small room off the kitchen, closer to the bathroom. Easier on my hip. I moved my things down that same afternoon. 3 months after that, Grant mentioned he needed a real office to relaunch, and that my study was sitting there empty most of the day anyway, wasn't it? So I packed up 41 years of ledgers and service logs and photographs into cardboard boxes and carried them down to the basement myself. 14 trips. Nobody offered to help me with the boxes. I want to sit on that for a second, because out of everything that happened in that house, the forgery, the theft, the thing with the doctor, that is the detail I still can't set down. Nobody insulted me. Nobody had to. 2 able-bodied adults sat in that kitchen and listened to a 68-year-old man go up and down basement stairs 14 times with boxes, and it did not occur to either one of them to stand up. If you've ever had somebody stop seeing you, not turn on you, just stop times seeing times you, then you know that's not something you can bring up. There's no sentence for it. You say nobody helped me with the boxes out loud, and you sound like a petty old man keeping score. So you don't say it, you just carry it down there with the boxes and you set it in the corner with them. Now here's what I did notice, because noticing is what I've done for a living since I was 22 years old. I've read balance sheets for 4 decades. I can tell the difference between a business that's struggling honestly and a business that's being bled from the inside, and I can usually tell it inside of 10 minutes. The tell is never one big number. It's the small things that don't have a reason. Grant's new business cards showed up in October. Heavy stock, embossed lettering, the kind of card that costs real money for a man with no income and no clients. Simone's car changed from a Corolla to a leased Tahoe over the course of one weekend in August. And there was a contractor's truck parked at the bottom of my driveway for 11 days in September, and when I asked about it, Grant told me they were sealing up some foundation cracks down in the crawl space. I hadn't authorized a contractor. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't been asked. And I told myself it was fine. That's the first place I come off badly, so let me be straight about it. My gut had been telling me something was wrong since about July, and I overrode it. 4 decades of instinct, and I overrode it, because a father wants to believe the boy he raised still has something decent rattling around in there. I called that patience. It wasn't patience. It was hope wearing a work shirt. And I'll come back to that, because it's the whole point of me telling you any of this. The real crack came on a Wednesday morning in late October. I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee when the mail truck came up the road. Same time it's come every weekday for 21 years. Otis has been our rural carrier since Clinton was president. And before I could get to the door, Grant was already out on the porch in his robe with a cup in his hand, waiting. He took the whole stack from Otis, gave him a wave, came back inside, and went into my old study and shut the door. 40 minutes. When he finally set the mail on the counter for me, it was a grocery circular, a coupon booklet, and a flyer from a church I don't attend. I stood there holding a stack of paper that weighed about nothing. And here's the specific thing that put ice in my stomach. It was the 23rd of the month. My quarterly statement from Chickamauga Valley Bank and Trust comes on the 23rd. Has come on the 23rd for 34 years. It wasn't in that stack. I watched it happen 3 more mornings that week. Same robe, same coffee, same 40 minutes behind a closed door in a room that used to be mine. And on the 4th morning I did a thing I'm not proud of, and do not regret for 1 second. I waited until they left for what they called a lunch downtown with a prospect. Both of them dressed better than they'd dressed in months. And I went out to the pole barn. Now our county garbage pickup won't take loose paper, and Grant knew that. So there were 3 feed sacks sitting behind my tiller, and they were full of shredded paper. He'd bought himself a shredder. A man supposedly rebuilding a freight brokerage out of his daddy's study had gone and bought himself a heavy-duty crosscut shredder. I carried all 3 sacks down to my workbench in the basement, spread out newspaper, and turned on the shop light I hadn't used since I rebuilt Ruthie's porch swing. It took me the better part of 4 hours. Most of it was nothing. Printouts from real estate sites, drafts of invoices for a company that didn't exist anymore, pages that didn't mean anything to me. But down near the bottom of the 2nd sack, my fingers caught on paper that was different, heavier, glossy on one side. I set those pieces aside and started matching edges the way I used to match columns in a ledger that wouldn't balance. Slow, one at a time. Refusing to guess at anything I couldn't actually prove. That's the discipline. That's the only thing I've ever been genuinely good at. About an hour in, I had the corner of a letterhead. Chickamauga Valley Bank and Trust. The bank Ruthie and I opened an account with in 1991, with $400. I kept going. My hands had started to shake by then, and it wasn't the cold, though that basement in late October will get after you. A date, 6 days old. A recipient line. I taped the last piece of that line down and read my own name looking back up at me off a piece of cardboard. Odell Tullos. Not Grant's name, not Simone's. Mine. I kept working until I found the sentence that mattered. Congratulations, Mr. Tullos. Your application for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $740,000, secured by the property at 721 Cravens Bench Road, has been approved. I had not applied for 1 dime of that. I had not signed 1 piece of paper. I sat down on an upended 5-gallon bucket in my own basement, and I looked at those taped-together scraps until the shop light started to swim. $740,000 against a house I paid off with 21 years of Friday nights on the wrong end of a wrench. And here's the thought that came to me, and it wasn't about money at all. Somebody got close enough to me to become me, not steal from me, become times me. Close enough that a bank that's known me for 34 years believed it was my hand on that page. And then I thought about Ruthie's rings. Her wedding set is in a small fireproof box in my closet, along with her mother's cameo brooch. I had them both appraised 3 years ago for the insurance, and then I put them back in that box, and I have not been able to make myself open it since. I waited until the house was empty again the following Tuesday. Went up and opened that safe with hands that would not hold still. Passport, insurance papers, the deed, my discharge papers, and a small velvet box in the back corner, sitting open. Empty. Now this is where most men do the thing that loses them everything, and I want to talk about it for a second because I think it's the single most useful thing in this whole story. Most men confront. Most men walk out of that closet with the empty box in their hand and go find their son and start hollering. And I understand it. Believe me. I stood in that closet and I wanted to put my fist through the drywall so badly my whole arm ached. But I ran 9 branches for 32 years, and not one of them ever failed. Not one. And the reason is not that I'm smart. There are 100 men smarter than me in this valley. The reason is that I never once made a move before I understood exactly what I was standing in. Anger is a luxury for a man who doesn't have to win. I had to win. So the next morning I drove down the mountain to Chickamauga Valley Bank and Trust, and I sat down across a desk from a commercial banker named Roz Ferrante, who has handled my accounts for 8 years and who has never once talked to me like I was old. I told her everything. All of it, start to finish. She pulled the file up on her screen and went quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to think I'd made a fool of myself. Then she turned the monitor around. The application had been submitted online with my social security number and a notarized power of attorney. A power of attorney I have never signed in my life. And here's the part that Roz caught because she is very good at her job. The notary seal on that document belonged to an office in Walker County, Georgia. That office had closed 9 months earlier. Whoever forged it had pulled a seal off an old document and never checked whether the notary still existed. The loan was approved. It was set to fund in 12 days. I asked her to freeze all of it quietly. No letters to the house, no calls, flag it internally for fraud review and buy me time without tipping my hand. She said she could do that. And then she said something I've thought about a lot since. She said, "Mr. Tullos, I need you to understand if this had funded, you'd have been the one paying it back. The bank would have been coming after you." I said I understood that. She said, "I don't think you do. They wouldn't just have taken your money. They'd have made you the debtor." Then I did something I have never in my life had a reason to do. I drove down to Fort Oglethorpe, paid cash at an electronics place so there'd be no card statement my son could stumble over, and bought 2 small indoor cameras with audio and a battery backup. And then I went out to my own pole barn and got 3 trail cameras off the shelf. I've hunted that ridge since I was 9 years old. I've had trail cameras on my property since before my son could drive. Nobody in that house had thought about those cameras in 15 years. Neither had I, until that afternoon. Ruthie would have laughed at me. 68 years old, reading glasses sliding down my nose, watching a video on my phone about how to pair a camera to a home network, at my own kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night. It took me 2 evenings after they'd gone up to bed to put them where they needed to be. The hallway outside the study, the kitchen, and the sunroom, where I'd started noticing my son took his calls with the door pulled to. What I heard over the next 9 days put the whole thing together. Grant's brokerage hadn't failed from bad luck. It failed because he'd been double brokering loads, taking freight at one rate, handing it off to a carrier at a lower one, and collecting on both ends without telling anybody. It works until a carrier doesn't get paid and starts making calls. 2 of his former customers were 1 filing away from a civil suit. And he owed money. Real money. $610,000 on a personal guarantee he'd signed with a private lender out of Knoxville called Talent Capital Partners. Now I want to correct something, because I know what you're picturing, and it's wrong. Talent Capital is not a bunch of gangsters. There's no baseball bats in this story. There are 11 people in an office park off Kingston Pike with a lawyer on retainer, and that is so much worse, because gangsters can be reasoned with and a judgment cannot. Simone said their name on a call one night in a voice I had genuinely never heard come out of that woman in 11 years. She was scared, not annoyed, scared. So the $740,000 was never a rescue plan for their finances. It was a payoff, with enough left over according to one conversation I caught at about 11:40 on a Thursday night to get somewhere with a lower cost of living once the equity was drained out of my house behind my back. And then, 6 days before Thanksgiving, I heard the one that stopped my heart. I was sitting in my truck at the bottom of the driveway with my phone, because that's where I listened to them in the cab, with the heater running, at the bottom of my own driveway, like a man casing a house he'd built. Simone was on the phone with somebody about paperwork for what she kept calling the transition. And then Grant's voice, low and businesslike, the voice he uses when he's closing. He mentioned a residence over in Cleveland, Tennessee. He called it a cognitive care community. He mentioned a lawyer in Dalton who had already drafted a conservatorship petition. And he mentioned a physician who had agreed for a fee to do a records review and put his name to an opinion about a cognitive decline that does not exist. I have never been diagnosed with anything in my life more serious than high cholesterol and a bad left hip. They were going to have me declared incompetent. And here's the trap, and I want you to understand how airtight it was, because it took me most of that night to see the shape of it. Once a court declares a man incapacitated, that forged power of attorney doesn't have to stay hidden anymore. It just becomes real, retroactively, legally, and every single thing I might do to fight it. The hollering, the accusations, the frantic phone calls, the man showing up at a bank saying his son is stealing from him, all of that becomes evidence. That's the part that put me on the floor. Not the money. The fact that if I had done the normal thing, the human thing, the thing that 99 men out of 100 would have done in that closet with the empty velvet box in their hand, I would have handed them their case. My rage was the last ingredient they needed. I sat in my study that night, the den. My son had the study with Ruthie's picture on the shelf, and I did not sleep at all. And somewhere around 4 in the morning something happened in me that I've only felt maybe 6 times in my life, and every one of the other times was right before I closed a deal I knew was mine. It wasn't anger. It was quiet, flat, settled, almost restful. I knew I was going to win. The next morning I called Roz Ferrante and asked her to help me build a file. Timestamps, transaction records, the forged instrument, the dead notary seal, all of it, organized, the way you'd build a package for a lender. Then I called Booker Pyle. Booker's a retired assistant district attorney for Hamilton County, 36 years. We've fished together out of the same John boat on Nickajack every spring since 2004, and in 21 years I have never once asked that man for anything. He listened to the whole thing without saying a word. Then he said, "Dell, don't go home and pack a bag. Go home and act exactly like you acted yesterday." And then I did one more thing. Booker gave me the name of an investigator, and through her I made contact with Talent Capital Partners. Quietly. Through the right channel. Not to threaten anybody. Just to confirm the debt was real, and to let them know through a lawyer, in writing, that a certain payoff they'd been told was coming might not arrive in the form they'd been promised. I'll be honest with you about why I did that. I could tell you it was to verify the debt. That's true, and it's not the whole truth. I did it because I wanted them at my house. I wanted my son to look up from that table and see the actual size of what he'd built, and I decided the whole thing would happen on Thanksgiving. At the table Ruthie picked out at an estate auction up in the Sequatchie Valley in 1991 and made me load into a truck in the rain. In front of every single person my son had invited over to help him perform the story that this was still a normal family. And I played my part for 6 days. This is the second place I don't come off well, so here it is. I let my hands shake more than they shake. I asked Simone the same question about the turkey twice in one evening, on purpose, and I watched her look across the room at Grant, and I watched him give her the smallest nod. That nod told me everything. I wanted them relaxed. Confident men make mistakes and say things out loud, and I needed my son relaxed enough to talk with a house full of witnesses in it. But I want to tell you what it actually cost to do that, because nobody talks about this part. For 6 days, I let my own son believe I was losing my mind. And I watched what it did to his face. And here's what it did: nothing. There was no grief in it, not one flicker. He wasn't sad about it. He was relieved. If you have ever tested somebody you love, set a small trap, told yourself you were being careful, and then watched them walk straight into it without hesitating, then you already know that being right about it is not a victory. Being right about it is the worst thing that can happen to you that week. I'd have given that $740,000 and the 9 acres under it to have been wrong. Let me stop right here for 1 second, because we're coming up on the part I've never told all the way through, not even to Booker. If you've made it this far with me, hit subscribe. Not later, now, while you're thinking about it. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what the clock says where you are, because I like knowing who's sitting with me. And tell me one other thing while you're down there. 6 days. Should I have done it? Or should I have walked into that study on day one and put it to him straight, man to man, and taken my chances? I still don't know. Tell me. I read them. Thanksgiving morning, that house smelled like a house is supposed to smell. Except Ruthie wasn't in it, and the smell wasn't hers. Simone had hired a caterer out of Signal Mountain, which she had paid for, according to the records Roz pulled for me, with a deposit that traced back to a bridge advance against a home equity line that had my name on it and somebody else's handwriting underneath it. I want you to sit with that one. They catered my Thanksgiving with my own forged loan. 26 people by 2 o'clock. 2 of Grant's old freight contacts down from Nashville. Simone's sister and brother-in-law from Hickson. 4 neighbors off Ox Highway I've known for 20 years. A couple from church who used to sit 2 rows behind Ruthie. Not one of them had the first idea what they were about to be in the room for. I sat through the appetizers. I sat through a toast Grant gave about family and about second chances and about how much it had meant to come home. He looked right at me while he said the part about coming home. My hands were folded in my lap. My heart was going about 110 and my face was doing absolutely nothing, and I want to tell you that took everything I had. Now I want to slow all the way down, because what comes next took about 90 seconds, and it is the whole reason I'm sitting here talking to you. They started carving at the far end. Somebody laughed at something. Simone's brother-in-law was telling a story about a boat, and I stood up and moved toward the head of that table. That's my seat. That's been my seat for 34 Thanksgivings. It's the one where you can see the window over the sink, because that's where Ruthie stood, and for 32 years I ate every holiday meal of my life looking at the back of my wife's head while she stirred something. I put my hand out toward the chair, and Simone's hand was already on the back of it. She hadn't hurried. That's what I keep coming back to. She'd been standing there. She had gotten up and positioned herself behind that chair before I ever left mine, which means she knew this was going to happen before I did. And she said it. This isn't your seat anymore, Dell. There's a place set for you in the den. She didn't raise her voice, not one bit. She said it the way you'd tell a caterer the salad forks were in the wrong spot. Flat, administrative, like a correction on a seating chart and not a 68-year-old man being removed from the head of a table in a house he built the back half of himself. And my son looked at his plate. 26 people went absolutely still. I want to describe that silence for you because I've never heard one like it before or since. It wasn't shocked silence. It was times embarrassed times silence, which is worse, because embarrassed silence is what a room does when it has decided not to help you. A fork stopped about 4 inches off a plate at the corner and just hung there. My neighbor, Loretta Cargyle, who brought a casserole to my house every Tuesday for 2 straight months after Ruthie died, looked at the tablecloth. Simone's sister put her hand flat on her own chest. The caterer's girl came through the doorway with a gravy boat, read the room in about half a second, and backed straight out again. Somebody's chair creaked, and every single person in that room was waiting to see what a broken old man was going to do about it. Here's what was going on inside me, and it's going to sound like a lie, and it isn't. I was calm, because for the first time in 14 months, somebody in that house had finally said the true thing out loud, in front of witnesses, at volume. 14 months of moving me down the hall 1 room at a time, and never once naming it, and she just named it, in front of 26 people, some of whom would remember it, and every one of whom would repeat it. She handed me the last thing I needed. But I'll tell you the other thing that was in me, and this one I've only said to one person. I wanted my seat. Not the house, not the money, not the win. I wanted to sit in that chair and look at the window my wife used to stand at on Thanksgiving one more time. And I understood, standing there with my hand 6 inches from that chair back, that I was not going to get that. Not that year, and probably not ever, because after what was about to happen there would not be another Thanksgiving in that room with people in it. That's what I gave up. That's the actual cost, and nobody ever counts it. I nodded once. I picked up my napkin off the table and I folded it into a rectangle and set it beside my water glass, squared up to the edge. I told the room I needed some air, and I walked out through the kitchen, across the mudroom, out the side door, and down to my shop, and my footsteps were completely steady on a floor I laid myself in 1998. Behind me, I heard the conversation start up again. Fast, too loud. The way a room does when it's trying to paper over something. Somebody laughed. That's the part that stays with me. Somebody laughed within 10 seconds. Now here's what nobody in that dining room knew. Booker Pyle and 2 Hamilton County deputies had been parked on the shoulder of Ox Highway, about 400 yards down, for the past 35 minutes. A staff attorney from Talent Capital Partners and a process server had been sitting in a gray Malibu at the bottom of my driveway for 20. And every word spoken in that house for 9 days was already time-stamped, copied, and sitting in the hands of a man who spent 36 years putting people in front of juries and who does not care for watching old men get robbed by their children. I stood in my shop for 11 minutes. I want to tell you what I did in there, because it isn't what you'd think. I did not make a phone call for the first 4 of them. I stood at my bench, and I put both hands flat on it, and I looked at the pegboard where I've had every tool outlined in black marker since 1986, so I can tell at a glance if something's missing. And I thought, if you make this call, that boy does not come back from it. Not the marriage, not the money, him. He does not come back from this. And there was a version of that afternoon where I put my phone in my pocket, walked back in there, ate a plate of catered turkey standing up in the den like a hired man, and started over on Monday with a lawyer and a quiet civil filing, and nobody at that table ever knowing a thing. I want you to know I considered it seriously. Not for a second, for 4 minutes. And then I thought about a doctor in a county I don't live in, being paid to write down that my mind was going, and a residence in Cleveland, Tennessee, with a code on the door. And I made the call. I came back through my own front door 11 minutes after I walked out of it, and I was not by myself. Booker came in first, calm as a Sunday. Sport coat, no tie, folder under his arm. 2 deputies behind him. And behind them, framed in my doorway with the November air coming in around them, a woman in a black overcoat from Talent Capital Partners and a man holding an envelope. That dining room came apart the second they crossed the threshold. Simone's sister knocked over a wine glass. I heard it hit the floor and go, and 26 chairs pushed back at more or less the same time, and the sound of it was like a wave. Simone went white, not pale, white like paper. And Grant came up out of his chair so fast he caught the edge of the table with his thigh, and the whole thing jumped. "What is this?" His voice broke in the middle of it, right in the middle of 3 words, before I'd said anything at all. I didn't answer him. I looked at the woman from Talent and gave her the smallest nod I've ever given anybody. She was very professional about it. She said her name and her firm's name, and she informed my son that the $610,000 outstanding on his personal guarantee was being called in full, and that a complaint had been filed that morning in Knox County. And the man beside her stepped forward and handed Grant an envelope, and Grant took it, because when somebody hands you something, you take it. That's just what a body does. He was served with a lawsuit at his father's Thanksgiving table, with 26 people watching. Then Booker stepped up. And Booker Pyle has a voice that spent 36 years explaining true things to 12 strangers at a time, and he did not raise it 1 decibel. He informed my son and my daughter-in-law that they were being formally reported for forgery of a notarized instrument, identity theft, attempted mortgage fraud, theft over $10,000, and conspiracy, and that the sheriff's department had been briefed on every line of it 2 days prior. Grant turned and looked at me, and the mask came all the way off. I had never seen that face on him. Not when he was 4 and I whipped him for lying about a broken window, not when he was 17 and wrecked the truck, not once in 41 years. "You don't have anything," he said. His voice was shaking. "It's your word. That's all it is. And every person at this table has watched you get confused for a year. Ask them. Ask any one of them." And there it was. He said it out loud, in front of 26 people, in the room, on the record. That's why I let her take my chair. I reached into my jacket and took out my phone. I did not say 1 word. I did not explain anything. I set it flat on the table next to a bowl of cranberry sauce, and I found the file, and I pressed play. And my son's own voice came up out of that little speaker into a silent dining room, talking about a facility in Cleveland, Tennessee, talking about a lawyer in Dalton who had the conservatorship petition already drafted, talking about what the physician wanted for the records review and haggling about it, talking about how much would be left after Talent was paid, talking about how long it would take before I could be moved. Nobody in that room moved a muscle. Loretta Cargile had both hands over her mouth. One of the Nashville freight men was staring at his own plate like it had personally wronged him. Simone's brother-in-law had stood up at some point, and I never saw him do it. And my son stood there, in the house I built the back half of, at a table his mother picked out in the rain in 1991, completely uncovered in front of every single person he had invited to watch me be quietly and politely removed from my own life. The recording ran 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I let all of it play. And then I said the only thing I said to him that day. I told him that a man who spends 41 years working on machinery learns to hear a bearing going out about 6 months before it seizes. I told him that's not a talent. It's just what happens when you listen to the same sound for that long. And I told him I'd been hearing it in him since July, and every single thing after that had been me waiting. They read my son his rights, standing at my dining room table while a catered turkey went cold in front of 26 people. Simone was taken separately for questioning within the hour, once Booker made it clear that her handwriting was on 2 of the supporting documents. The people from Talent left without another word. Whatever they'd come for, they'd gotten. I stood in my own front hall and watched 2 patrol cars back down my driveway. I saw my son's face against the back window for about a second and a half before he turned it away. And what I felt right then was not triumph. I want to be very clear about that, because I've heard people tell this story back to me like it's a victory lap, and it makes me want to leave the room. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't grief either. It was something heavy that sat down between the 2 of them and made itself at home, and 4 years later it hasn't left. The house was quiet by 9 that night. Caterers gone. Guests gone, they went fast. And I don't blame a one of them. 26 place settings around a bird nobody ate. I walked every room, slow, the way I used to walk a branch after closing. Checking locks, checking shelves, making sure everything that was mine was where it was supposed to be. And I found the deadbolt I'd had put on the side door that morning, quietly, before any of it started. I turned it myself. Listened to it seat. That's the sound I remember from that day. Not the wine glass, not the recording. A deadbolt going home. Chickamauga Valley froze that loan permanently inside the week. Roz walked the paperwork through the fraud department herself and told me she wasn't about to let a man who'd banked there for 34 years get taken on her watch. Ruthie's rings turned up 19 days later at a pawn shop in Ringgold, just over the Georgia line. Her mother's cameo was in the same case. I drove down and got them myself. 40 minutes each way. I paid the man what he'd given for them, which I did not have to do. And I did it anyway, because he hadn't done anything wrong, and he had 3 kids' pictures taped to his register. Now let me tell you the part of this that I've had 4 years to work out, and that changed what I think this story is even about. I never taught my son the business. Not one thing. Not one afternoon. 41 years, 9 branches, and I kept the books myself the entire time. I never made that boy a partner. I never sat him down and walked him through a profit and loss. I never once let him watch me negotiate anything. And I told myself for decades that I was protecting him, that the pressure had nearly killed me in the early years, and there was no sense putting it on him. That was true. Here's the part that was also true, and that I did not admit to myself until I was 68 years old, sitting in a truck in my own driveway at midnight. I liked being the only one who could do it. I liked being the man everybody had to come to. I liked walking into a branch and having a problem stop being a problem, because I was standing in the room. And you cannot be that man, and also raise a son who knows how to handle money. So my boy grew up hearing times, "This'll all be yours someday." And someday is a word that means absolutely nothing to a man, until he's 41 and broke and sleeping in his childhood house with his wife, whispering at him through the wall about a lender in Knoxville. He didn't come home to rob me. I want to say that plainly. He came home broke, and then it occurred to him that the money was coming to him anyway, and that all he was really doing was fixing the timing. That's the sentence. That's the whole thing. He wasn't stealing, he was accelerating. A man can sign his father's name and still sleep at night if he's got that sentence in his mouth. And I'm the one who handed it to him. Not the forgery that's his, all of it, and he's serving for it, but the time sentence. I built the conditions where that sentence made sense to him. Does that excuse one thing he did? No, not one. He had a dozen doors, and he went through the wall. But I have stopped being able to tell this story like it started in October with a shredder. It started in about 1994, when a boy asked me what I was working on at the kitchen table, and I said grown folks' business, and kept my hand over the page. Here's what I'd want you to take out of this, and it's not what I expected to end up with. Everybody who hears this tells me the lesson is, times don't let family mistake your kindness for weakness. And that's a fine bumper sticker, but it isn't what happened to me. What happened to me is that I called something patience for 8 months, and it was not patience. Patience is a strategy. Strategy has a deadline on it. From the day I walked out to that pole barn, to the day the deputies came up, my driveway was 31 days, and times was patience, because I knew what I was waiting for, and I knew when I'd stop. The 8 months before that? That was just me being scared to find out. Because the second I looked, I'd have to know, and once I knew I'd have to do something, and what I'd have to do would cost me my son. So I didn't look. And in those 8 months, a bad thing became a much worse thing, and a man who might have been talked out of it got in too deep to be talked out of anything. My hesitation is part of what put my son in a state facility. I've made my peace with that mostly, some days better than others. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do, and it costs you nothing but a pen. If there's something in your gut about somebody you love, money that doesn't add up, a story that's changed twice, a room that goes quiet when you walk into it and it's been sitting there more than a month, put a date on the calendar, an actual date, 3 weeks out, write something on it only you'll understand. And on that day, you either look, or you decide out loud, to yourself, that you're choosing not to, and you'll stop calling it patience. That's it. That's the whole assignment. You don't have to accuse anybody of anything. You just have to stop letting someday times do your deciding for you. And here's the question I'd like you sitting with tonight when the house gets quiet. What are you calling patience right now? That's actually just being afraid of what you'll find. Grant took a plea 11 months later. Simone took a different one, and it was lighter, and I think it was fair, because she was the one who was scared and he was the one who was building. They're divorced. I don't have contact with either of them, and I'm not going to pretend that's a tragedy I'm carrying around. It's just what's true. I sold Tullos refrigeration and ice in the spring, all 9 branches. The new owners kept the name and every one of the 140 jobs which was in the contract, and which cost me about $1.5 million off the price, and which I would do again tomorrow. I still live on Ox Highway. Still got the trail cameras up, though now they're just for deer again. And that first night, after the patrol cars were gone and the deadbolt was turned, I went down to the basement and got the last bottle of the muscadine wine Ruthie put up in 2018. She made 11 bottles that year, and I had been saving that one for something, and I could never say what. I poured a glass and sat in her chair by the window and held it up toward her picture on the shelf. Because I'd kept my word to her, that's all. That's the only thing I had to say for myself that night. I did not let anybody blood or otherwise turn the thing we built into something they were entitled to just because they had my last name on their driver's license. So before you go, I want to hear from you, and I mean that honestly. Comment a 1. If you think I was right to run those 6 days to let my own son believe my mind was going, so I could get him talking in front of a room full of witnesses. Comment a 2 if you think that crossed a line, and I should have walked into that study on day 1 and put it to him straight like a father, and taken whatever came. And comment a 3 if you think the real mistake was the 8 months before any of it, the time I spent calling it patience while a bad thing turned into a felony. I've argued myself into all 3 of those at 2 o'clock in the morning. I still don't know which one I am. And tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what that clock on your wall says. Somebody out there is hearing this in a kitchen with one light on over the stove, and I'd like to know you're there, because I've sat in that kitchen, and it's a long night in there by yourself. Most of all, tell me if you've lived some version of this. If somebody in your family has ever mistaken your patience for permission. If you've ever been moved down the hall one room at a time by people who never once raised their voice while they did it, you're not being dramatic. You notice something real. Noticing it is not the hard part. Doing something about it while there's still a person left to save, that's the hard part. And I was 8 months late, and I'd like for you not to be. If any of this reached you tonight, subscribe before you go. That's the one that actually matters. I put a new one of these up every week, and the next one's already written, and I think it'll sit with you the same way this one has sat with me. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Chattanooga, Tennessee, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.